This is part 12, and in this part we intend to discuss liability of an endorser. Now, in order to understand endorser, you must know what do you mean by endorsement, and in order to understand endorsement, as we dealt with section 15, what is the requirement of understanding endorsement? Because we are dealing with negotiation. And what do you mean by negotiation is defined by section 14. And there we have learned that in order to negotiate a negotiable instrument or to have a negotiation of a negotiable instrument, it depends upon the nature of the instrument. If it is a bearer instrument, it can be negotiated by mere delivery. But if it is an order instrument, pay to X or his order, if that is the wording as far as promissory note is concerned, or if that is the wording as far as bill of exchange is concerned, or maybe for example in case of a check which is not a bearer check, because in case of bearer check you can go to the bank and collect payment at the counter. But in case of, if the check is not bearer check, then in that case, for example, in order that person wants to put it into circulation, what he will have to do? He will have to make an endorsement. There must be an endorsement and delivery of the same. When we were discussing provisions as far as negotiation is concerned, along with section 14, I had also drawn your attention to section 46 of the Negotiable Instrument Act, which and that is the heading of the chapter. Right from section 46 up to section 60 is the chapter where the heading of the chapter is negotiation, to which we had reference every now and then, and we will continue. Kindly excuse me, there is bound to be repetition, because the nature of the subject, which I personally feel is such that unless there is repetition, unless there is revision, and unless your fundas are clear as far as this procedure is concerned, it may not be possible for you to understand the provisions of the Negotiable Instrument Act. In addition to this, let me again, which I have told you in the first part of the lecture itself, but today also repeat it, that if you find out after listening to the lecture that is delivered by me that you have some doubts, yes, by all means you can mail me, and then once you mail me, I will try to resort to that mode of communication. But if no purpose is likely to be served, at times oral explanation is required. You can just let me know your number, and then I shall contact you as per my convenience, because convenience, and hence that will serve the purpose from the point of view of understanding, or that is exactly what I want. I want you to understand the subject with which we are dealing. The other day we had discussion regarding this subject, and then nowadays when you talk about Negotiable Instrument Act, everybody is concerned only with one section, and that is section 138 of the Negotiable Instrument Act. Very true, very correct, precisely right. But the point is that as we have this enactment, namely right from section 1 up to section 147, unless that has been repealed, we have to study the law, and once you go on studying the law as the changes that have taken place, you understand the importance of the law during course of time. So when we were discussing endorsement, coming back to the point, there we have learned that which are different kinds of endorsement. Why, is it that endorsement should be on the back of the paper, it's a back of the negotiable instrument itself, or you can, there can be addition to it as per the, when you person, for example, he can have an endorsement on a slip of a paper, and it's there too. Yes, that is what is known as allonge in day-to-day life. While discussing Negotiable Instrument Act, there are some aspects as far as the theory is concerned, right from section 1 up to 147, and there are some practical aspects. So at the time of learning the same, I am drawing your attention to various sections for the simple reason that yes, these are the sections, yes, without which it is not possible. But in addition to that also, it is necessary for you to learn something more than that, and that should be your approach so that it becomes possible for you to have mastery over the subject with which we are dealing. So after discussing different kinds of endorsement, we during part 11 I told you, now this is a time for us to start discussing liability of the endorser. And in order to discuss the liability of the endorser, the sections to which we are going to refer to are: 1, we start discussing. Now let me tell you why I am making mention of the section number. During course of time there can be addition to it. Yes, very correct, bound to be, because the nature of the subject is such. And hence now from yesterday onwards I have started telling you the procedure. So during course of time, for the purpose of understanding the provisions of the Negotiable Instrument Act, unless you know this, unless you know the practical aspect of the subject, it may not be possible for you if you merely confine yourself to the sections and start understanding the set. And then correlation of the sections is very important. For example, when we start discussing now liability of the endorser, immediately it will click you when I explain this. Section 30, we start with section 35. And what is section 35? Section 35 deals with liability of endorser. And what it says? It says, in the absence of a contract to the contrary. So if there is a contract to the contrary, and this has got reference to what? This has got reference to section 91 of the Indian Evidence Act, which you can, whenever I tell you some sections, the time for you to, refer to those sections so that your understanding regarding those sections becomes clear. That speaks about exclusion of oral by documentary evidence. There cannot be oral evidence. And then when we deal with the documentary evidence as far as Indian Evidence Act is concerned, we deal with what? What do you mean by primary evidence? What do you mean by secondary evidence? What do you mean by public document? What do you mean by private document? Accordingly, how a document is required to be proved in a court of law. All these details you learn when you deal with the provisions of the Indian Evidence Act accordingly. So now, in the absence of a contract to the contrary, if there is contract to the contrary, yes, then you have to go as per the terms and conditions which are laid down in the contract. But otherwise, whoever, the further part of the section says, whoever endorses and delivers a negotiable instrument before maturity. So what he has done? Such a person has endorsed and he has delivered a negotiable instrument before maturity, without in such endorsement expressly excluding. So he doesn't, in the endorsement excludes or making conditional his own liability. So he has not made mention. Do you remember? We dealt with what do you mean by and without recourse to me. That is what is known as sans recourse endorsement. There is no recourse to the person, namely the endorser. So he has not done so. So in the absence of a contract to the contrary, whoever endorses and delivers a negotiable instrument before maturity, without in such endorsement expressly excluding or making conditional his loan liability, such a person, such endorser, is bound thereby. So he is bound to whom? He is bound thereby to every subsequent holder. So he is liable thereby to every subsequent holder in case of dishonor by the drawing, acceptor or maker, to compensate such holder for any loss or damage caused to him by such dishonor, provided due notice of dishonor has been given to or received by such endorser as hereinafter provided. And the last part of the section says, every endorser after dishonor is liable as upon an instrument payable on demand. So this speaks about what? Liability of the endorser. Now, if Mr. B has negotiated, namely he has transferred a negotiable instrument to C, C to Mr. D, D to Mr. E, E to Mr. F, and F to Mr. G, and then to Mr. H accordingly. Now, in this case now, there is endorsement on the part of Mr. B there is endorsement on the part of Mr. C, there is endorsement on the part of Mr. D because of the nature of the instrument, namely it is an order instrument. B writes down, please pay to C. C writes down, please pay to D, and he signs it. D writes down, please pay to E, and he signs below this particular sentence, and everybody delivers. So now when we want to talk about who is an endorser, B is endorser, C is endorser, D is endorser, E is endorser accordingly, and what is their liability? Now, unless if you start reading to know, if you want to know liability, then naturally what is the liability? Liability of liability of endorser is dealt as far as section 35 is concerned. And what is that liability? It says is bound, such a person, namely endorser, is bound to every subsequent holder. So he is liable to every subsequent holder. In other words, when we talk about liability of Mr. D, D has put it into circulation to Mr. E. So now there D is liable to Mr. E. So E has got right to recover amount from Mr. D. Now when you talk about liability of Mr. D, D is liable to whom? D is liable to Mr. E. So endorser is liable to whom? Endorser is bound thereby to every subsequent holder. So when you talk about liability of Mr. B, and if the negotiable instrument is with Mr. E, naturally Mr. B is bound, or the amount can be recovered from Mr. B by whom? By C, by D, and by E. So this is, this is made very clear as far as section 35 is concerned. Subject to what? In the absence of a contract to the contrary, there should not be a contract to the contrary. And then it says, whoever endorses and delivers a negotiable instrument before maturity without in such endorsement expressly excluding or making conditional his own liability is bound thereby to every subsequent holder in case of dishonor by the drawing. Now when the liability starts only in a case where the negotiable instrument is dishonored. Negotiable instrument is meant for payment, yes, but then this dishonor of a negotiable instrument with which we shall be dealing, when we to certain extent I had mentioned in the past that in case of a bill of exchange is required to be presented for the purpose of acceptance, and there provisions regarding acceptance with which we shall be dealing right from section 61 up to section 76 of the Negotiable Instrument Act. And then when we start right from section 77 up to section 81, this is a chapter which deals with presentment for payment. So that also we will take into consideration. And hence now, if it is dishonored, by whom drawee? But who is supposed to dishonor? That person will dishonor who is supposed to carry out payment. And now, when you talk about three types, by this time I hope you must have mastered the provisions as far as three negotiable instruments, having reference to section 13 of the Negotiable Instrument Act, with which you are dealt. And which are those? One, promissory note. In case of a promissory note, it is the maker who is supposed to carry out the payment. In case of a bill of exchange, the direction is given to the drawee to carry out payment. And in case of a check, drawee is a banker and the banker is supposed to carry out payment. So if the check is dishonored by the banker, so by dishonor of a check we mean the amount is not paid. That is, exactly, to simplify it, this, what do you mean by dishonor? The amount is not paid. Or in case of a bill of exchange, the amount is not paid by the drawee means who becomes an acceptor, with which we have dealt, but we shall be, I will make this very clear to you, don't worry. Or In case of a promissory note, it is the maker. So if it is dishonored, so E presents a promissory note to the maker of the promissory note for the purpose of payment, or Mr. E presents a bill of exchange to drawee now, who is an acceptor for the purpose of payment, and then if it is a check, he has presented that check, he has deposited check to the banker, and the banker has returned the check by refusing the check for various reasons. When banker is justifying refusing payment with respect to the check, and rest of the details with which we shall be dealing in detail, no doubt about it, but at the same time try to understand what is the remedy that is available to Mr. A. It is dishonored. And then if it is dishonored, when it is dishonored, we shall be dealing with dishonor of a negotiable instrument by referring to, as we will proceed further, we shall be dealing right from section 91, which when we will take into consideration notice of dishonor. So this starts right from section 91 up to 98, with which we shall be dealing. So what is required? If Mr. E wants to recover amount from any of the prior party, because he has got right to recover amount from prior parties, but how he can recover the amount? Provided he has given a notice of dishonor. So that is required. What is the manner in which a notice is required to be given? What are the details of the same, with which we shall be dealing? Yes, during course of time. But otherwise, this is, what section 35 says, then in that case, every is bound thereby to every subsequent holder, in a case of dishonor by the drawee, acceptor or maker, to compensate such holder for any loss or damage caused to him by such dishonor, provided. So he has got, that is the liability of the endorser. B is endorser, C is endorser, D is endorser, E is endorser. As far as it is with E now, and if he puts into circulation, then he becomes what is known as an endorser if he negotiates. But then he is, in that case, for example, he has got right, but when he has provided what is required to be done, provided due notice of dishonor has been given to or received by such endorser as hereinafter provided. So that we are going to deal with notice of dishonor. If notice is given by E to Mr. D, then he can only recover amount from Mr. D. If D wants to recover that amount from Mr. C, it is must that the notice of dishonor is required to be transmitted. He has to give, Mr. D has to give notice of dishonor to Mr. C, then only it is possible for him to recover that amount from C, is the aspect with which we shall be dealing during course of our lecture. But this is when we start discussing liability of endorser, liability. So when you take into consideration intermediate party, namely Mr. D, D has got right to recover amount from Mr. C, whereas he is liable to whom? To the subsequent party. He is liable to Mr. C, is liable to Mr. D. Same is the case as far as D is concerned. D has got right to recover amount from prior party, and this is exactly time for you to have reference to small e as per section 118, which deals special rules regarding presumptions, evidence with which it deals. And says what is, how it is possible for you to know whether it has been negotiated from Mr. B to C, C to D, or D to E, and E to F accordingly. This what the order of endorsement which appears on the negotiable instrument on the back of it is the order. So you have to proceed as per that order, find out who is the prior party, who is the subsequent party, and then it is possible for you to recover the amount as far as this is concerned. This does not mean that I have covered everything. No, certainly not. I am also fully aware. That's why I am trying to explain you in such a manner so that everything becomes very clear to you during course of time. For that, have some patience. start understanding, start reading, start learning, which will serve the purpose. With this now, the next second section to which I want to draw your attention in order to know liability of the endorser is section 38. And section 38 deals with what? Prior party a principal in respect of each subsequent party. This has laid down a principle. And what is the principle as far as liability is concerned? It says, as between the parties so liable as sureties, each prior party is, in the absence of a contract to the contrary, also liable thereon as a principal debtor in respect of each subsequent party. Act which is done, this has got what? This is the time for you to understand what do you mean by surety, what do you mean by principal debtor, and in order to understand liability of the principal debtor, and you must know the contract of guarantee. And in order to understand contract of guarantee, you have to start reading right from section 126 onwards as far as the Indian Contract Act is concerned. Act which is done by the so when there is a relationship of what? Creditor, principal debtor and surety. So now here this is the relation, because I have already told you why A undertakes to pay to somebody, because he is debtor and the person to whom he wants to pay is a creditor. So accordingly now this section 38 deals with what? As between the parties so liable as sureties. So liability, his role is that of, if the amount is, I hope, if this is the time for you to refresh your memory as far as section 126 is concerned. If I go to the bank and get loan from the bank for which Mr. Z has stood as a surety, and if in that banker is creditor, this is what is known as contract of guarantee. I am principal debtor and Z stands as a surety. So what is the right of the creditor? If I don't pay the amount, he has got right to recover that amount. So this is recover that amount from Mr. Z, who has stood as a surety. So provision, as and when it is necessary, I will refer to those provisions also, no doubt about it. But this you have to understand. So now if when you talk about D, who is an endorser. So what D has got right to recover amount from prior parties, and then D is liable to whom? To the subsequent party. So that is made very clear as far as section 38 is concerned. If it is necessary during course of time, I will come to this aspect. With this now we come to section 41. And what is section 41? Section 41 says acceptor bound although endorsement is forged. And it says an acceptor of a bill of exchange already endorsed is not relieved from liability by reason that such endorsement is forged, if he knew or had reason to believe the endorsement to be forged when he accepted the bill. Now this is as I thought that, let me finish up with the liability as far as the endorser is concerned. Hence I have referred to this section. But yet you do not know, when we will have one lecture in which we will work out all the details, but for the purpose of knowing all the details as far as the bill of exchange is concerned, this is also the time for you to understand some provisions, and then it becomes easy for you to understand. So an acceptor of a bill of exchange already endorsed. So bill of exchange is already endorsed. Now such acceptor is not really. So what is the liability of the acceptor? The liability of the drawee starts only when he has accepted the bill of exchange. And then, for example, when we will discuss the procedure regarding presentment for acceptance, and for that I mean, as I have told you, we will consider right from sections 61 up to section 76 in detail. You will come to know. But it says, in such a case, an acceptor of a bill of exchange already endorsed is not relieved from liability by reason that such endorsement is false. So he is not relieved, acceptor not relieved. When? If he knew, if the acceptor knew or had reason to believe the endorsement to be forged when he accepted the bill. So if he has accepted the bill of exchange, at that time he was aware that the endorsement is false, such acceptor is not at all, he cannot, I mean, he is not relieved of his liability. So that is, I mean, in the when you talk about, I mean, endorser, this is to be correlated with what? This is to be correlated when it is with respect to what? With respect to the endorser. With this now, section, as I mean, we proceed further section, one section that I mean you have to, I mean, understand is section 40, which talks about discharge of endorser's liability. When the liability of an endorser will come to an end. And section 40 says, where the holder of a negotiable instrument, without consent of the endorser. So there is separate chapter with which we shall be dealing as far as when the parties are discharged from their liability. And for the purpose of understanding this, we will refer to right from section 82 up to section 90 of the Negotiable Instrument Act, and the heading of the chapter is discharge from liability. So when I mean the parties are discharged from liability, it deals with the same with which we shall be dealing. So now when endorser's liability will come to an end, when the endorser is discharged from the liability, when it is not possible for the subsequent party to recover amount from endorser, and that is exactly the stage at which it can be said that endorser is discharged from his liability. And what section 40 says? It says, where the holder of a negotiable instrument without the consent of the endorser destroys or impairs the endorser's remedy against a prior party, the endorser is discharged from liability to the holder to the same extent as if the instrument has been paid at maturity. Now, when the party, this you will understand very clearly. As I told you, I tried to club the sections together from the point of view of understanding. But there are some provision, as I mean, unless you understand right from section 82 up to section 90, discharge from liability, it may not be very clear to you. Hence, what we will do, we will, I mean, for the time being, note it down. But I will draw your attention again to this section once we, I mean, start regarding the chapter discharge of liability. With this now, the time for me to draw your attention as after dealing with this, we will start trying to understand, as we are trying to go through almost all the provisions of the Negotiable Instrument Act during course of our lecture, and instead of proceeding chapter wise as they are in the Negotiable Instrument Act, what we are trying to understand, we are trying to understand by correlating the section. So we intend now in the next lecture, because I mean now you have understood some procedure as far as this lecture is concerned, this will continue. And then as far as the next part is concerned, what we shall be doing, in the next part we will start discussing liability. And for the purpose of understanding liability, what we will do, we will start discussing, I mean, this has got reference to what? Section 26 up to section 45A, which deals with parties, and then further part right from section 26 up to section 29, who can be a party to a negotiable instrument with which you are dealt, And now this is the time for us to understand what is the liability of the parties who are first. So once you come to know the parties with respect to the negotiable instrument, you have got general idea as to the parties with respect to the negotiable instrument. We will try to understand the liability. And for the purpose of understanding liability, we shall be dealing with some of the sections. For example, we will refer to, so when you try to understand liability, you must read section 30. You must read section 31. You must read section 32. As far as the liability of the endorser is concerned, we have already, dealt with what I had referred to section 35, section 38, section 40, and section 41. So these are the sections with which we shall be dealing. We will also deal with section 36, section 37, and then section 39. So these are the sections, and there may be some addition to it, no doubt about it, during course of our lecture. But we will, in the next part, will start discussing liability, and then it may be possible for me to make you aware regarding some other aspects as far as the procedure is concerned, which one has to understand from the point of view of understanding the Negotiable Instrument Act, with which we will continue at the time of discussing liability of the parties, by having right in the beginning reference to this section, and there may be an addition to this during course of time.